distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Stefanie Fishel. She's at the University of Alabama. She's in the Gender and Race Studies. And her main interests are environmental theory and justice. And she got her PhD at Johns Hopkins, and most recently she was at Hobart and William Smith College up in upstate New York as a visiting assistant professor, and at the University of Alabama since 2015. Her forthcoming book is titled New Designs for Global Thriving, Bodies, Worlds, and International Relations. And I've had a very enjoyable conversation with her this morning about issues that probably a lot of us don't think about, but I believe that she's going to open up the doors to some new lines of thoughts for us. So please welcome Dr. Stefanie Fishel.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I guess always good to start out with thank yous, and the big one goes out to all of you sitting here, because I know everyone has plenty of things to do. So it's always nice to see people come and sit down and listen. As well as thanks to the C-Lab for this invitation. It's been a relatively quick invitation to come down, so I want to talk kind of broadly about how social sciences and the natural sciences can have a cross-dialogue. So I started with what I hoped was kind of a provocative and sexy title, which is what we're worried about a lot of times in social science, and that is, can bacteria be political? Really as a way to begin to think about how our disciplines discipline us into thinking about the kind of topics we can and can't talk about. I started out in life as an international relations theorist, getting a master's in Canada, where I thought about war and conflict and the way the individual has a personhood in international law. And then when I moved on to Johns Hopkins for my PhD, I realized that many of the things I wanted to talk about didn't quite come across in the topics that I was choosing. So eventually I narrowed down to thinking about what the body can tell us about politics. There's a long tradition in philosophy about the body politic, which is a way to naturalize and understand politics through the way our bodies work. And one of the things I started to think about was, listen, all these guys were talking about bodies as they understood them in the 17th century. In the 18th century, what do we know about bodies now, right, that might be different? And that can be all kinds of medical advancements, right, being able to image the body and the brain. And then that led to trying to find a way to talk about them. And I know in talking with my friends who are scientists and in my conversations this morning, a lot of what you do needs to be translated to a lay public, right? And some based on your own kind of the way, if you're an introvert or an extrovert, how you can do that differs, right? What kind of stories can we tell about the science that we do, about the studying that we do? So for me, I use that metaphor of the body politic, right? When you take something from one realm, move it into another, that helps people understand, right? Like when we say things about important concepts that we can't tangibly feel, like love, right? We talk about those metaphorically. Love is a journey, right? Love is an adventure. We take what we think we know about journeys and adventures and the feelings that brings up, transfers them to something more intangible. And that's what I think as scientists and social scientists, we're always trying to translate what we see and feel, how we understand the social and natural world through that. So that serves as a small introduction to my work. What I wanted to focus on today are first some questions and provocations about how the natural and social sciences work together. We've been separated for some time, right? You could see earlier writings, John Locke, early philosophical writings especially, I mean, even tracing across beyond our Western traditions into Chinese Islam. We used to write as kind of polymaths, right? People who understood a little bit about everything, could trace through ideas. And then, as I think the creation of the university, we begin to be put into smaller and smaller pieces, right? And then as we get our degrees, we also end up in smaller and smaller knowledge places too. We talk about littler and littler things, particular bacteria, or a particular idea, or a particular theorist. and we have trouble crossing. So what I wanted to do is frame this in terms of what are the pressing societal, cultural, political problems that we face, right? Both worldwide, in the US, and in Alabama, right? So we can center that around ideas of climate change and changes in ecosystems. And then how it is that our disciplines discipline us to see those problems, and how can we speak across them. So in order to give you more of an idea of what I mean by disciplines, I want to spend some time thinking about how the hard and soft sciences would look at objects and things and what that means. And then I want to talk a little bit about how we can answer that question, can bacteria be political, with the remarks I'm going to make now. And then depending on how much time we have, talk a little bit about some recent work I've done with some co-authors about thinking about how my discipline, which is international relations, right, which talks about states and their relations, right, as well as nations, how it understands important planetary processes like climate change, and what kind of dialogue needs to happen at the global level to make something like COP21 make sense in our discipline. So, some questions and provocations to begin. Hard and soft sciences, how are these distinctions important, and what do they already do? And when does it help us and hinder us? Are we prisoners in our own vocations? Right? Can we not think about certain things just because of our training? And then practical questions, especially given coming to the University of Alabama and being a social scientist, and part of my title in my department is to make contact and liaison between hard and soft sciences, is what do we need to work with each other? Do we understand what we do? You know, like, if someone desperately needs a social scientist on their grant, what does that mean besides just being a name on a line, right? And so I've asked over the last year at University of Alabama, when I cross the halls, and I say, what does that mean to you? What do you think I do, right? Here's what I think you do. What do you think I do? And oftentimes we don't know, right? We end up with this incommensurability in between us. And importantly, along this, like, how does this interdisciplinary dialogue allow us to address issues differently? Does it? Should it? Is this what we want? If we have a push to have philosophers on board or social scientists, does that help us in ways that are important, right? And how do we translate that? And I'll use the term, which will become a little clearer later, what does intra-action look like? Right? How do we make steps toward that? And what does that mean from each discipline? So the important question we'll leave open for now is how can we open dialogues across the discipline, right? What are interactive collective politics? And what about all of the multiple issues that we deal with, right? As scientists, you often have varied concerns, right? Particular kinds of seagrasses, particular kinds of fish, marine mammals. From the social science point of view, we might think about things in terms of lenses that race and gender give us. Where does environmental justice and social justice intersect? And what does that mean? And importantly, part of my research tells me that we need to rethink the difference between things and people, right? That in fact, interdisciplinary is important, but also thinking about how we've disciplined ourselves to think in terms of subjects and objects, right? That there's a world of nature, and there's a world of culture, there's a world of people, and there's a world of things. When in fact, they're interrelational and interdependent on each other. So how can we add in these things that we study? And oftentimes, from our various disciplines, we tend to be very passionate about those things, right? You're here studying them because you care about a particular thing over another. And this leads to a broader question of how do we think about nature? I'm curious to think how scientists think about nature. What does it mean? Is it something different from people? How are culture and nature separated in your field? And how do those practices need to be thought about in order to react and respond to these really important, complex, interdependent, and relational problems in the world? In other words, we need to find new collectivities. And sometimes this may mean getting out of our silos, to use the term that's been in fashion lately. It may mean other things. It may even getting out of the ivory tower completely, speaking to activists, speaking to communities. Where do we see our roles? And how do we begin to look at these dichotomies of nature, culture, and relationships with humans and non-humans in a different way? To be able to say what we have in common, right, at all levels. So this is the realm that I live in, right? And this is the realm I feel comfortable in. And that's one of power, competing values and views, the realm of politics that's viewed as future-oriented, ongoing processes of power relations, right, in environments of shifting agents. So it's not just about voting or constitutions or representation or normative issues and debates, but rather how we create, how we co-form worlds with the people around us and with the things around us that matter. In this way, we could see it similar to the way a theorist who works in this area named Barad does. Politics is then defined as our ability to respond, right? It's a kind of responsibility in the sense that we need to find ways to respond to the multiple issues that we see around us, and how do we do that? So if we linger a little bit on the social world, since I'm a social scientist, let's come back to disciplines, because that puts us in a place to kind of make this a little more concrete. Now I'm following this pretty closely to a scholar named Andrew Pickering, who's a science and technology studies scholar, who tries to think about how we carve up the world in particular ways, right? And this is broadly in my field called a posthuman view. And when I say posthuman, rather than conjuring up cyborgs and things that this often does, I'm talking about how we create ourselves as subjects. Like, what does it mean to be human? And maybe we don't spend a lot of time thinking about this. I know I teach this to my undergrads every semester in some form or another, but I ask them, what does it mean to be human? How is it we're different from other things, right? This often comes down to, well, we can use tools. Well, other animals we now found are pretty good at using tools, right? Some birds are. Our primate cousins. Is it language? Well, other species also have language. Even bacteria seem to quorum sense and communicate in particular ways. How do we see ourselves as humans? So when we talk about posthuman, we think about what is the way we see ourselves that engages in politics, that engages in the world around us in such a way that might be different than the way we see ourselves now. So we could broadly say that the natural sciences sees a world of things, right, where people are often absent, right? So there's an idea of objectivity and a need to understand the systems themselves, right? And social science and the humanities talk about people. We don't talk about things. Durkheim would say that the social is a separate reality, right? So we have the natural sciences in the world of things. We have the soft sciences and humanities as a world of people. So there's a beautiful dualism here, right? A world of things and a world of people. And we work within those, right? But what about the intersection of people and things, right? What happens there? So the hard sciences tends to be a little less concerned about this distinction and this intersection. There can be a world of things without people, right? And often situations will take on scientific models of knowledge that takes the place of politics, right? We think if we have a model, if we have a law, if we have that's neutral, that this can take the place of politics. We're merely working within a framework. And these can often be a reliance on scientific facts, right, which can be good. And in fact, we see a lot of the debates now about whether these facts are true or not, right? When the scientific community has overwhelmingly said, yes, these facts are true, this is how we create knowledge, the pushback is there's some other agenda. But this is harder for the social scientists, right? This distinction between people and things. It's really hard for us to imagine a world without things, right? So in order to keep a purity in our disciplines, the social scientists would see this world as drenched in meaning, right? In a way that the natural scientists wouldn't necessarily see. The world means many things, and these meanings are in our head, right? They're not in things. These meanings are in our head and society. So we can go ahead and study the meanings that people attach to things without assuming to get into the territory of the natural sciences, right? You study things, we study the way people think about things, therefore we keep ourselves in our own boxes. We can't assume neutrality in science, or in law for that matter, right? And in fact, what I'm trying to talk about is this disciplinary division of labor doesn't let us see that we don't just discover and record in any discipline, right? And that this, similar to something like the Heisenberg principle, we can know our position or our momentum accurately, but not both simultaneously. And that's the idea, that what happens in a world of knowledge where you can understand one but not the other? How do we begin to shift? So the social sciences are about human meanings and attitudes towards things, and the hard sciences are about the things in themselves. And that we all accept this basic split at some level, because we all keep working within our disciplines in particular ways. So this also lends itself to thinking about the real and reality in a particular way. The social sciences would often see themselves then as bowing to the hard scientists and say that the hard scientists get things right because you have a particular empirical way you face the world. And the social sciences are left with, as Pickering writes, the soggy social residue. But what if we don't accept this split, right? What if we argue that despite our tools, our focus, that we can never get beyond meanings, right? So that in fact the scientific world and the social world construct their own meanings. So the material world, all told, is constructed in social practice, right? William James would say that the world for us is a blooming, buzzing confusion, and that we make sense out of it, right? And that the tools of science help us do that, right? We can measure things, we can maybe see things more closely, more accurately, but that in itself is deciding to study one thing over another, right? That is not a neutral place to be. So there's nothing wrong intrinsically with the split. It's about knowledge creation, it's about epistemology, this purity in the disciplines. But it's crucial to remember that these units aren't compulsory. Right? And as I talk to people, there's often a sense too of an individuality. The reason people get into academia, the reason that people would get specifically into science in academia, oftentimes are not suited to dealing with the world of people. Right? This is what I hear from a lot of scientists, that I'm just good working in my lab. If I have to talk to people, that's a problem, right? Whereas the social sciences tend to, I think we all have our dysfunctions, but we would tend to bring in people who would be more geared toward thinking through. So there, of course, is a natural place in which we begin to think, well, if we want to put our science in action, or if we want to ground our social sciences in something that's very much attached to the real, there's a great place for us to meet in the middle. So if you don't accept these units of analysis, or if you think there's a good reason to kind of have a social scientist on a grant, or to speak with a scientist about important things that a social scientist might be studying, we could call that seeing double, right? Which is how Andrew Pickering helps us think through this post-human, right? That actually thinking through a blending would be able to see people and things together, right? We should bring back these disciplinary divisions of things and people, overlap them, and use them as a lens to see. So then it becomes, if the health of a Gulf community means the health of dolphins, or the health of bacteria in it, or particular kinds of seagrass that keep erosion from happening, how is this framed as a way to understand how this affects the world of people, right, as well? We can't take them as hegemonic disciplines, either one of us, that can be defined in one way. We know that just by looking around the room, right? You're all here for separate reasons. You see science as something. Your gender, your race may push what science thinks of itself, right? The fact that you're sitting in the room now is different than it would have looked 100 years ago, right? So these things change. They change with time, and they change with who becomes academics, who become scientists, who become social scientists. So that is to say that they're all complex and varied approaches that include sets that differ over time and space, right? and that the desires and directions of individuals within this very much make a difference. Right? You choose to study what you are studying, right? And that was made for particular reasons. And a dialogue between them can help us bring out this complex nature of who decides, right? Which is basically one of the main questions of political science, right? Who gets to decide? Who makes the exceptional choice in these situations? How do we do that? Is it democratic? Is it fascist? Is it autocratic? Do a council of scientists do it? How do we make those decisions? Who is in control? Who we see as what matters in politics, right? What political science would call a subject. Who is the subject of the law? And how does that matter? And what I would like to argue is that these should be open, inclusive, and careful to reflect the values and ethics that are necessary in creating mutual public space. So the minute things are made apolitical, the minute things are taken as natural fact, that's when we end up in a place where we can no longer debate. Right? What if, even more importantly, the challenges that face us in the future make it impossible to keep supporting this shift? Can we do it, right? Can we keep our disciplines separate? What if they require no less than seeing double all the time, right, to fight for the survival ahead of us, right? Which means an interesting question when we need the biosphere way more than it needs us. Right? So if we look at it from that direction, things might become more complex. And what subjects do we need to have for the coming years? So this brings me, I think, to some of the research I've been doing, and then I want to come back after we talk about this more practical application of how I'd see earth sciences coming into play with my discipline of international relations. And we'll answer that question, can a bacteria be political? Which is an open question and which would be fun to talk about in question time, which I'll leave time for. Speaking of time, I did not pull out my timekeeping piece. Can someone give me a... Okay. 11:23. So, in one of the latest publications I have, which is co-authored with various people in my discipline, we wanted to take this double vision, this blended approach, and look at climate change. So if there's one thing we found out in our research that showed up really clearly, and I think it's reflected in a lot of writing about climate change, is that the science has done its job exceedingly well, right? There's a lot of data and there's a lot of knowledge about how the systems are changing, right? The study of climate change goes back to the early 19th century when scientists struggled with the fact that the Earth was once covered in glaciers, right? We've seen these cooling and warming happen multiple times. In the 50s and 60s, the effects of industrial pollution were studied, right? We have Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring. We have a lot of international law through this time regulating rivers and oceans and whaling, right? And how the Keeling curve at that time showed that carbon dioxide was increasing. So by the 1980s, we really have a consensus. We have a scientific consensus that things are changing and that humankind may be responsible in part for this. And I remember growing up as a Generation Xer, right? My grandma couldn't get Aquanet hairspray anymore with the CFCs in it, right? And how suddenly there were changes in our lives that, you know, hairspray didn't spray the same anymore. This was frustrating for the ladies who liked their particular kinds of hairstyles. So I remember these things, you know, coming in and affecting, and we did a good job with the ozone layer, right? In fact, in some ways we did almost too good of a job in that we're now warming the planet with our desire to fix that hole. But now, especially if you're following the hashtag #ExxonNew that has been happening in the last couple weeks, as well as the collapse of a great many coal and oil companies across the globe, and a pushback, a kind of rising, public rising against the way that they hid the knowledge that they had gathered 35 years ago. Right, part of it has become, the big part of it has become a failure on the part of political will and the ability to organize. Now, Naomi Klein, in her book, This Changes Everything, talks about how this is the process, it's the end product of the state losing power and people losing their ability to organize at the grassroots level. So you have this kind of moment and we're now seeing as a crisis. And she argues that this is a good kind of crisis, like the old-fashioned idea of crisis meaning a break and a time to make a difference, and that this may be a time to recreate a world that's more fair and just for everyone, right? As we begin to change from a fossil fuel civilization into what comes next. This is all told, these problems of climate change, problems of pollution, what social science calls a wicked problem, right? And partly pollution, climate change are wicked problems because they can be hard to see, right? You cannot understand the processes underneath them. We have beautiful sunsets in Tuscaloosa, right? And we know that's in part because of the pollution. We know that we breathe an extra pack a day of cigarettes in when we live in Alabama, but that's something that's hard to see, right? Even when we look at the figures of how many people have congestive heart failure and emphysema problems next to coal plants, it becomes a problem that doesn't offer any clear solutions, and sometimes only better and worse responses. And honestly, many of the changes that we're facing because of rising seas, which you see here, a football field that lost to rising seas a day, right, a day? Okay. In Louisiana. So this is really a collective action problem of the highest order. And this is being reflected in lots of places. In international relations, we would see kind of a transnational problem, one that things flow across borders. In the United States, we'd see there being a problem with pollution because rivers flow from one state to another. But some problems are intrinsically local, but fractured and reflected in all places, right? So problems of water, clean water, problems of sea level rise, they become a global problem in a very local way, right? And to be able to react to them means understanding them as a local problem, but always as a local problem that is reflected in all kinds of localities. If we have dangerous acidification of the ocean by mid-century, we have to ask a question about if our politics are matching the planet and the changes that are coming. And this is importantly about us, right? And it demands a different way to do politics. Right? One that sees a wider approach, and one that could see an international agreement as a call to arms as opposed to just a way to pat each other on the back and say it looks like we could finally get these states to agree on something, which isn't enough, right? It's a starting gun, but not enough. So in this case, right, we used Earth system science and looked at the planet boundaries model just as a way to begin to understand how global ecosystems work and how we feel that international relations hasn't been able to, even though the most global of all the social science disciplines react in such a way that would look at the studies that Earth system science gives us. So, I'm probably usually give a talk to this to social scientists who would be on the other side of it, right, not knowing a lot of this piece of it, but our major global ecosystem processes, of which there are 9, we've met the thresholds of those, and that is within where we can exist safely, right, as humanity. 3 of these thresholds specifically we've met and have been crossed, and that the threshold for biosphere integrity has already been crossed. And so there's at the beginning of COP21, the astronauts from the International Space Station did a 9-minute video saying, if you could come up here and you could see this little thin layer that keeps us from the vacuum of space, right? Maybe you could see a different kind of politics and a different way to think about the globe. So what kind of positions do we need to listen to, do we need to step into to be able to understand how we continue to, and I think importantly, not just get human life to thrive, but how human life can thrive with the many species that are also on this planet with us, right? If we don't see humans as the top of an evolutionary chain of being and rather a kind of cosmic roll of the dice, where does that put us, right? Are we stewards? Are we in a battle together? we want to use a warlike metaphor with other species, and how do we fight that? So all told, right, and in some cases, as we know in Alabama and we know in politics right now during this election cycle, we haven't moved past debating the truth of global climate change yet, unfortunately. So not only do we have to have a fight to bring the conversation to the table in a meaningful way in our part of the U.S., we also have to think about more broadly how we're going to live in this world we've created, because our fossil-fueled civilization is dying. So the question becomes, how are we going to live on the earth we made, and how can we take this with us into the future? So Roy Scranton, in his book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, asks, how do we learn how to die? And this may seem like in some ways it's a dramatic question, but in other ways it comes back to what I was pointing out before. How do we become new subjects that can live in a markedly different world without the ease of fossil fuels? Right? Fossil fuels have allowed us to come to the place we're at. Without them, where do we go from here? So it is my strongest contention, and the reason that I'm here is that it has to be interdisciplinary, right? Interdisciplinary within the academia. It has to be by making connections in places we wouldn't necessarily think about. It means talking with activists. It means working with indigenous tribes who are suffering rising seas in Louisiana, in the bayou regions. It means making all kinds of connections legally in ways that we maybe haven't thought of before. So in the article that I'm referencing called Planet Politics, we used the format of the manifesto, right, in order to bring a kind of rhetoric to it, that we wanted to try to get people to think through both the specter of a coming catastrophe and also as a new kind of political and disciplinary commitment that could lead us to transgressions that break grounds for new rights, a new way of thinking about how we talk about borders, for instance. Like, how do we attach ourselves to the land right now? Right? In political science, we talk about being attached to the land through states, right? We are part of U.S. because we live on U.S. soil. What does that mean for us understanding, say, our particular ecozone, right? How would we connect ourselves to the United States through living in the Gulf area, right? Through the kinds of concerns and political interests you would have here as opposed to what you would have elsewhere, right? In part, our founding fathers answered that through our system of federalism, but in many cases, the demands on that system and its inability to shift may be a part of what we need to think about retooling. So really what we have to do is think about what it means to be an individual, right? And what it means to be connected to the people around us and to the places around us in a different way. And now I'd like to come back to the question. I'd like to kind of leave, I've also done a very not representational study of talking to some people this morning about what they see kind of the politics as being, which was kind of an interesting mirror to what I've been talking about elsewhere with social scientists. And it seems to be, if we talk about the kind of issues that you're dealing with here at the C-Lab, how do we motivate publics, right? How do we get there to be a public outcry? How do we get people to understand, those that are affected by the kinds of pollution, natural and man-made disasters? How does that happen, right? Through education, through K-12, do we have that kind of time? As well as in enforcement, right? There's a lack of teeth. And in my discipline, international relations, we're good at that. We already have talked about that for a long time. We are in a system of competing sovereign states in a so-called anarchical environment where the people who follow the law, or the states, the persons that follow the law, are also the ones that make the law, which leads to an interesting problem of enforcement. Right? You can bow yourself out of any decision at the international level as a state if you don't want to be a party to the solution. So we're good at that, right? That's a place where I think international relations and people working at local levels can give a lot to each other. it's partly about knowledge production, right? It's partly about the way we see our disciplines as creating knowledge and how that knowledge is translated, right? If you think, John Oliver just did a piece on scientific studies, if any of you watched it, and that part of the problem that scientists are facing is, if you do the p-hacking, you can take these things, you can make you've got correlation, doesn't make causation. There's a problem with people not trusting science, in part because is coffee bad for you? Is red wine like an hour at the gym? There's a sense of a wishy-washiness that's partly because of a translation through the media and through common understandings of it. So how does the knowledge production that you have in science get validated and be understood? When we have one climate science denier for one scientist, it makes it seem as if it's an equal battle. It's not 97 scientists saying to 3 people who don't believe it, right? So how do we begin to show that to a public? Also, where we're at matters, right? And I see Alabama as a place that's crucial for so many fights that we need to have here, along all kinds of lines, right? There was a Gulf component at COP21, right? The seas are rising and so are we, right? So there's a large amount of activism through this area waiting, right? And something I didn't know that I learned from one of the activists I met from Mobile, we're sitting on tar sands. The beginning of Keystone XL is here. This is the southern end of it. And it's been put on hold in part because of the fall in oil prices, and in part because of the pushback against Keystone XL on the other side. Do we want Alabama to become Alberta? And if we think about the forest fire there now and the changes that are happening, we can see how Alabama becomes crucial in a fight against a kind of relationship with nature that would mean taking too much from it. All right. So come back to the question for my last bit here. Can bacteria be political? So in some ways, I ask this as a way to be provocative, right, in the sense that, I always get in my head the feeling like this little bacteria with a sign, right? You could make a joke out of it, like free the whatever. But at the same time, the tradition that I work within is called broadly a materialist tradition, right, which now we've termed new materialism, which means that we look at publics and the creation of publics as not just about language, deliberation, and abstraction, right? We turn our focus to the things inside of it and the ways in which the objects, the materials, all the things around us demand to be noticed, right? That in fact it's not easy to say that we are individuals, right? We're actually co-evolved with many species, right? We're not the kind of humans we were before we have dogs, and dogs aren't the kind of things that they were before they became dogs, right? It's about us living together. Sometimes about we are what we eat. So if we turn our attention then to the ways in which the objects and these things and non-humans demand to be political, we think about how political capacities can begin to reflect those, right? Because then our ethical commitments become much different, right? Using a bacterial Purex on your hands becomes an ethical decision where you have to understand the way bacterial communities work, right? So it can broaden that, and it can actually bring in how political capacities worked and how we enact citizenship and participation in these communities. And these can run across all kinds of places. Lots of people institutionally disenfranchised, right? In fact, colonialization in much of the world, those people in Africa, India, Asia, the places colonized, were seen as objects, right? We can see it very clearly that international law was born from a desire to figure out how people fit within this order. And in fact, they were just turned into things, right? And the question then becomes, how do we talk about all of these and their political capacity and helping us put us in a historically bounded space that takes into account all of the political problems we've had in the past? So all of these elements create or constrain or inform political involvement, right? And I always feel like when I stand and talk to scientists, like, you understand these things really well, like, in a way that social scientists can't quite get across, right? We may take up a thing because it's interesting or sexy in that moment, like, well, how does political science look like quantum physics, right? As opposed to quantum physicists who spend their life really caring about the quantum world, right? And not in a way that tells us something about something else, but actually about what that means and how we study it. And this then, importantly, kind of leaves open how we define the problems, and then we look more at how we create a politics of knowledge creation, right? Which then can go across multiple kinds of justice and environmental justice, right? If we learn how to attack some of these environmental justice problems, we're also attacking problems of race and problems of gender, right? And problems of other kinds of deep-seated problems we see across the world in very productive ways. So following an article by Waterton and Souvalis where they talk about the politics behind cyanobacteria in a lake in UK, they've come up with some very interesting ways to think about knowledge and where we might need to go. And I would like to share these now because I think it's a good way to start the discussion. Nature is not self-evident or predefined or separate from culture. This is one of the things we really need to think about, right? The nature-culture divide and what separates us from the world in which we live. Right? We've done that already. We have seen ourselves as at odds and as masters of nature, and clearly with the changes we're seeing, that has not gone well, right? For many life forms. We must debate knowledge, right? So anything that we see that's taking knowledge out of the realm of somewhere debated, somewhere political, somewhere where we can all have a say in it, becomes a problem, which means we need to create publics that are able to debate this knowledge, right? It means pushing back. It means getting education. It means outreach. It means people understanding the kind of things at a deeper level. It also means understanding that we live in a contingent and uncertain world, and that this is actually our core condition. We have to give up our desire to control it. And how do we do that? Right? That's a difficult question. We must also create connections between people and things. Right? In this case, we could begin to think about how dolphin health is reflected in human health, and how human health is reflected in dolphin health, and knowing that one helps the other, right? And being able to tell people that that it's not separate. And ultimately, to conclude, it kind of leads us to a decrease in hubris, right? And an increase in the doubt that we might have facing the world, right? A doubt in our abilities as our disciplines to be able to explain things completely, a desire to reach across to other disciplines and to other people, and importantly, I think, in a lot of situations, to ask the communities what they need, right? To think through what matters at different levels, and to begin to ask people what makes sense within that. And if we do that, we can break a lot of disciplinary boundaries and a lot of boundaries toward political change that we need to see happen in a complex, interrelated, forward-moving project that's politics, and that's much more than voting. So I'll go ahead and end there because I'd like to have some time for discussion. You get to talk into a microphone. Does this work? Hold on.
How should we go about engaging the voting public in the state of Alabama who clearly have a jaded view of climate change, science, and evolution? How do we turn that around from what it is right now, which is a just so story? This is all false.
I mean, that's one of the open questions, and I think in some ways, I'm new to Alabama, right? So I have some guesses. I have some thoughts about how one does that. It would be about thinking about education, perception, outreach, but really, what do you think? I mean, how do you see it as people who have gathered the facts and then have them ignored, where does one begin education? You have K through 12 here. I mean, I think it's about education, right, in large part. So how does one begin that process of, I also think, and this is important, maybe I could have you think through, people don't like to think about, especially climate change, right? Do we want to think about that? Do we want to think about how things are going to change? Do we want to think about how our electricity grid is a demand grid, and that whenever we turn on a light, we get light? If we switch over from coal or nuclear facilities, might we not get light or power every time we turn something on? And what would that mean for our lives? What might we have to give up, right? Which I think is interesting. We have to talk about what we'd be willing to sacrifice and who might make those sacrifices. Are we happy already with the people who are currently making sacrifices within our institutional system? Do we need to rethink that? So that's, I think, a big important piece of it too.
So I know, like, the South is known as being deeply religious, and that's also part of the communities where that's where a lot of people go. It's where they meet each other. It's where they connect. Are there efforts that you know of, like, where scientists try to engage with some of the leaders in these communities to kind of get the people to see science more positively or as a moral obligation, like if we're being stewards for the world that God created? How do you do that? Like, are there efforts to do that and show them, like I guess, put the science in a context where they see it as being important to them as moral beings?
I mean, I think that's a great suggestion. I think that's an important one. And I think I did a movie showing at UA on the Naomi Klein's movie, This Changes Everything, and we had an activist from Mobile named Ramsey Sprague come up. And he's the one who really got me thinking more deeply about that is, yes, I mean, especially in the Black community, reaching out to churches, right? And I think communities all told through the South, that's an important place to begin these conversations, right, to think about it. That could be a kind of a scientific outreach, you know. And being not religious myself, I'm not certain what the challenges are, but I do know that meeting people where they're at is a really good way to start, right? Understanding that.
I know the Discovery Hall program here and also at the Education Center in Mississippi, they get a lot of like Catholic schools or Presbyterian schools that come in and learn about the Gulf community, like the animals that are there in the environment and how it's important. And I guess I see that as a good way to get these kids involved and that they see the connection, like their school that is, like, I guess, funded by a religious organization finds it important for them to come to a research lab and learn a bit about the environment.
Right, so I think more broadly this could tell us that the institutions that we have are super important. Right? Like at this, you know, we don't need to reinvent the wheel at some point. We need to figure out, both look at the systems that we have and where we could work within them. And for, you know, those of us who are academics, figuring out how one would get such a grant to somebody's desk where they would say, listen, I think it's great to approve this $20,000 in an outreach program, right? How do we begin then to translate that, which would partly, I guess, this is one of the reasons would be that I've noticed in speaking with the UA scientists, the part of a social scientist, right, would be able to translate this in such a way. But we couldn't do that without knowing what kind of words that you use to get us on the grant, right? It becomes kind of a specific problem where we need to learn to speak each other's language in important ways.
But it's not just language, it's deeper than that. I mean, it's the worldview of most of the people who are raised in this region, or the predominant worldview. And one thing, and you can see it more so teaching undergraduates than I think graduate students, because the graduate students have a broader perspective. They have an undergraduate degree. They've come from all over different places, so they have different backgrounds and experiences. But one thing I think we struggle with in this region is this idea that religion and science are competing philosophies
or prisms through which to view the world. And they're not. And I think it comes out of the evolution debate initially. But I used to teach an undergraduate course for non-majors, a science course for non-majors, and we would talk about the history of the universe, the history of the Earth. We talk about evolution, and we would do things like radio dating, talk about those concepts. And students would say, I don't believe in that. The Earth is 7,000 years old. I don't believe in that. And so we'd have to have this whole conversation about belief versus science, which is material and testable. So it's not just how we speak or how we worship, but it's this whole view of the world and this competing idea that if you go to the hospital and get treated with radiation, it's somehow, nobody understands it just works. No, that's not true. We can predict it. That's why we use it. Just like we can predict the age of a rock. That's why we use it.
I do think science and math education at all levels could begin to gear itself toward understanding at that broad level what it means, like what we can and can't know, and that falls through. I think also at some level we can give up on the truth and falsity of these claims, even if just for a moment, to begin to understand why we find these stories so compelling, right? Like, if we're not worried then about the truth and falsity of something for a second, we can see how the world assumes one way to be true, right? And then maybe we could get to some deeper questions, or like if we say, okay, well, we're not going to be worried about the facts of this, the truth and falseness of whether religion or science is it, but what world do we live in where we assume that to be the battle we're fighting, right? And maybe that might be able to derail things long enough to come in to talk about the difference between faith and science, where faith is based on being able to believe something without proof, whereas science has, or without evidence. If we have science as a kind of belief in evidence as a way to truth, there's a way to talk about those worldviews and how they assume the world to be true in a way that we could find at least some point of middle ground where you can't if you just start from right or wrong. That's a difficult story to tell. And zealotry on either side tends to make that difficult.
So I'm not sure if your statement about putting this idea of being right or wrong aside is in response to what I said, because I think it's different. I'm not making a case that one has to say, if this is right, this must be wrong. My perspective is they're different things, right? We're still using them to view the world, but they're not at the opposite ends of a spectrum, right? They're different things altogether.
No, I think I'm answering it, and you just said it in a different way. That we tend to posit them, we don't see them as a spectrum or as the way you're putting it. We see them other ways, and to be able to, I don't have answers. I guess I want to put that out there. And in part, one of the reasons I'm here to talk to you is because I think together we can come up with things that help, right? And I wish I did have answers, and I wish I could say right now that I have a plan, but I think somehow we need to cultivate a kind of an openness in politics and a vulnerability and a not knowing that can also come from the scientific community, right? We know things, we don't know some other things, we can meet and talk about it there, right? I'm not trying to take anything from you. You're not trying to take anything from me. What we do have, setting those aside, is a common public problem, right, as we do in political situations about resources, about how those resources are used, about who gets them, about all kinds of things. Now that asks for a kind of public that we need to think about, right? And where do we start? And once we start that, how many levels up do we need to go, right? So for me, I see it as we need to talk about capitalism. We need to talk about the way religion and science work. But at this level, at the grassroots level down here, we need communities and to be able to come together regardless of what church they go to or whether they're in academia, and know that they have some kind of a common purpose. That becomes the kind of double approach from above and below. And in some cases, we all give ourselves reality checks on what can happen there. Like, oh, well, I have all these highfalutin ideas about how international law might work to help protect dolphins, but a judge is going to throw it out. That doesn't get us anywhere. So where do we have these fights, right? Where do we assign our precious resources to build change? And I do think from talk from people and from kind of teaching over the last 8 years, and my son's 14, I think that the below 18s see things a little differently, right? Like, I think we can already see a shift and a sea change in a lot of places and in a lot of the younger generation. I know I teach high school right now and in the afternoon, and they tell me a lot of things that are quite sophisticated, right? They have a real sense of the world and what they're walking into in a way that those of us don't who are older. So maybe we look to the youth.
Another point is the context of your talk is climate change, and then in the broader context of politics and how do we deal with this. But people argue that politics is all local, and there are places in the country where you wouldn't predict that people would be dealing with or planning for climate change and maybe trying to understand what's driving climate change that have to, right? In our own government, the Department of Defense has some of the most elaborate plans for climate change because they have to deal with deployments of troops and ships and supplies across the world. Miami, which is a very wealthy, conservative in some respects, at least fiscally, town, they're dealing with climate change in ways that places away from the coastline don't have to. So part of that is just you're going to have to deal with the reality of it, whether you accept or don't accept the drivers of it. It's happening.
And I think that's a kind of important. Sometimes when I'm speaking to social scientists or theoretical crowds, different crowds than this, people say, well, what can we do? And I can say, well, we can die. Like that's kind of an option. There's kind of a tragic realism to the end of it, right? But as you say, and it's going to hit different communities at different times. And this is where I think Naomi Klein's work stands out as being important, that we do need to look to those places that are thinking about it, planning it, or being directly affected by it, right, as a way to begin change. But again, we're fighting what I think we could call a disavowal, like just an unwillingness either to accept facts, empirical evidence about the changes that are coming, and also a fear. Fear of changing, a fear of giving up what we have. And that, in my estimation, means a change in the way we see community, the way we see how we share resources, the way we see how these things are spread amongst both globally and locally. So, I guess that's why I say at the beginning, politics for me is about how, in a shifting, changing, interrelational world, we deal with these, which means we don't have easy checklists. We don't have a lot of the things we'd really like to see, and they maybe have to come on a case-by-case basis. And that's where I think the interdisciplinarity really is important, right? You need all the people in the room that can help with the decision, all thinking about that. And I think climate change is a good example just because it's large enough to be able to imagine at both sides. And you're right, the Pentagon has a 300-page report on climate change, and the Senate sits around and talks about how it doesn't exist, and you want to say, well, you can walk over there. But the other question we have to ask ourselves ethically is, do we want climate change to be treated like a war, which is what the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security makes everything into Katrina would look the same as a terrorist attack. Is that the kind of response we want, right? Does that lend itself toward a kind of politics at the end that we can't come back from, right? Do we really want martial law to change our environmental issues? Like, is that where we want to find ourselves? That's an open question. Like, we could have a kind of exceptional politics that tells us what to do, but where do we end up in the end, right? What does that do to a lot of other political commitments we have? Don't we want it to be democratic and inclusive? We don't want there to be a declaration of martial law in order to deal with flooding, right? We'd want it to be something that came from the community and something that was sensitive to those places. So in that sense, like, We can use the Pentagon and the DoD as a way to say this is important, but are those the responses we want to support? Perhaps not, right? We might want something more sophisticated as far as thinking through what communities are suffering. And we do have a tendency, I think, to turn it outside ourselves. We can think, well, look at how badly, different countries have done in reacting to hurricanes or tornadoes or monsoons, but look what happened in Sandy. Right? Like, the government response completely failed. Katrina, the response failed, especially for people in rural areas, right? Sandy, there were people for 2 or 3 months without power, diabetics in wheelchairs on the top floor of apartment buildings that weren't getting their medication. Like, so we also need to look at our responses to environmental emergencies and how those can be fixed, and that can be done, radically at the local level as well. Thank you. Thank you very much.